What's going on, everyone? This is Travel May here, Himalaya ride enthusiast and entrepreneur. I'm back here once again as I bring you Chapter 11 from my book, The Himalaya, where the strobe flashes and the mirror ball spins. It's about my story on how my fascination with the Himalaya ride started, which leads me to my journey to one day call one of those classic rides of my very own. So if you'd like to purchase a copy, you can get it on Amazon or my online store. You can also get some Himalaya fan-based merch, along with my clothing line Switz gear. The web address is shown below the screen. So without further ado, I will bring you Chapter 11, titled An Opportunity of a Lifetime. Months later, as another fun-filled summer had come and gone, it was time for me to quit my summer job and start heading back to school, where at the same time, I just couldn't help but think about the new Himalaya ride, which was scheduled to be at the fair of 1997. I've been having dreams almost every night about what the ride would look like, especially the artwork. I had made plans to help out on the ride when the fair returned that following summer. I had constantly pictured myself being inside the control booth, running the ride, playing with the lights and siren, and talking on the microphone. Even if I was only working the platforms the whole time, well, that was just alright with me. I would be more than happy to do that as well. My last year in high school had actually gone a little smoother than my previous 3 years, but not that much. Toward the end of my last semester, I finally started to see a bright light at the end of a long, dark 4-year tunnel. I was given some special assignments from 2 different classes, which I was more than happy to complete. In one class, we were all given an assignment to look up some companies of our choice to write about a certain product or anything of that nature. I, on the other hand, decided to go a different route. I decided to write a passionate letter to the Carnival Company about the Himalaya's absence because I wanted to see for myself if Raheem was right about whether the new Himalaya ride would take place of their previous ride. Months later, I received my answer. I checked the mail and found a letter from the Carnival Company telling me that they had indeed traded in their Himalaya for a brand new one, which was the same information Raheem had given me from the lady who worked for the Carnival, whom he had talked to that night at the fair. I was so stoked about the letter, I immediately stored it in a box in my room for safekeeping. I occasionally take it with me to places until I lost it one day, and to this day I have no idea where it is. What I had to do was about my hobby. I would finally have a chance to show everybody what I was all about. They will all see a whole different side of me. About 95% of the student body never knew about my special talents and interests. I knew that if I was going to present myself, especially during my last year of high school, I had to go out with a bang. So I brought in my Himalaya model to class for everyone to see on that day of my presentation. I started off with a short speech about wanting to become an artist someday and then showed off a few of my drawings. I then displayed my Himalaya model as my grand finale. The model spun flawlessly as the car coasted up and down that 3-hill track from slow to fast. The mirror ball spun in the opposite direction and sparkled thanks to the 2 pocket-sized flashlights I had installed inside the model. The whole class was truly amazed by what they saw. My teacher was so moved that she actually invited a couple of other classes to come over to see my model perform its magic. Everyone was so thrilled that they actually gave me a standing ovation. A few hours and a couple of classes later, I learned that my model was the talk of the day. Other students who rarely talked to me on a daily basis shook my hand and told me what a great job I'd done on building a model of such a popular ride. I was prouder that day than I had ever been, and I will always remember that day for the rest of my life. Thanks to my model, I finally started gaining a little popularity, which only lasted the 2 months until graduation. I was more than happy when I finally reached my graduation because I knew I had finally reached the end of my 4-year ordeal. And thanks to that one project, I gave everyone at that school something to remember me by. Another July had come, and it was time of that year again. Yes, it was time for the state fair to return, and I was finally going to see the new and improved Himalaya. Not only I was ready to see the new ride after a whole year anticipation, but I was determined to help out the ride that summer. A few days before the fair opened, my mother wanted to go to the new casino at the fairgrounds, so she let me tag along. She went to the slots while I went to see if I could help out at the Himalaya for the 2 weeks. I started walking down the fairground where the rides were being set up. Seeing all the rides during setup was so interesting to me. But at the same time, I was nervous as hell because I really didn't know what these guys were like and if they were going to turn me down. I first ran into two men who were setting up the high roller ride. They asked me if I wanted to work with them. I politely thanked them, but told them the only ride I was looking for was the Himalaya. The two workers showed me where the Himalaya was, and I was on my way. When I finally reached the Himalaya, I noticed there were at least 8 men working on the ride's framework. 2 men were working on the roof structure, some were putting together the 3-hill track, and the others worked on the rest of the ride while going in and out of the trailer, grabbing parts of the ride to install and assemble. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I never would have thought in a million years I would actually see my favorite ride during this construction. The whole site was so fascinating, and I couldn't help but to take a moment just to watch this ride and this assembly. At the same time, however, I knew my time was limited. I had to do what I went there to accomplish, and that was to be part of the Himalaya crew for the next 2 weeks. I held my breath, marched over, and introduced myself and told them I was interested in helping out the Himalaya. One guy asked me if I was 18 years old, and I told him that I had turned 18 about 2 months prior. Sure, you can come work with us, but it's not up to me, he said. You have to talk to our supervisor, Charles. He just stepped out, and he'll be back in a half an hour. I told him that I would wait for Charles, even though I really didn't have that much time. But I wasn't leaving until I talked to this Charles guy to see if he gave me a yes or no to my request. By the name, my name is Terrence. I'm the Himalaya foreman, he said. It's nice to meet you, I replied. Terrence introduced me to everyone who worked on the ride, including his brother Daryl, who also worked with him. As I continued to wait for Charles, I started to shoot the breeze with Terrence and the rest of the workers to get a chance to know them better. But I couldn't keep my eyes off the ride structure. I also noticed part of the ride's top canvas was up. The colors of the canvas on this new ride were red and black, just like the one at Trimper's, but the design was just like their previous ride. I couldn't wait to see it in its completion. A few minutes later, I told him that I had to step out for a minute and I would be right back. I didn't want to leave, but I knew my time was running out, so I went back to the car where my mother was waiting for me. I told her that I had to go back to talk to the supervisor to see if I could help out at the ride. I rushed back over to the ride where I saw a man wearing sunglasses and carrying a walkie-talkie. Here's the guy you need to talk to, Terrence said to me. Is there something I can do for you, Charles asked. I told him I was interested in helping out at the Himalaya for the 2 weeks. I also mentioned that I had always been interested in the Himalaya ride ever since I was in my single digits, and I had dreamed about having one of my very own someday. Now that I was 18, I was willing to take a chance to learn a little more about working at the ride. Charles gave me an answer I never thought I would hear. He actually gave me a yes and told me to come back in the morning to help with the rest of the setup. I was so ecstatic that I ran back to the car where my mother was waiting for me. I told her what happened and smiled from ear to ear all the way home. As soon as we got back to the house, I immediately called my friends and told them that I would be working at the Himalaya at the fair and helping to set up the ride. I hardly slept a wink that night because I was so excited about being part of the fair by helping set up the ride of all rides, the Himalaya. I finally fell asleep around 4 a.m. and happily jumped out of bed around 7 o'clock. Now, I'm not normally a morning person, especially when still in school. But if the day was something that I look forward to, like Christmas morning or going on a trip, I'm usually up at the crack of dawn, full of energy and ready to go. I jumped out of bed, showered, packed a lunch, and I was out the door by 8 o'clock. This was also the day that I finally started to drive by myself for a change, which was icing on the cake. I reached the fairgrounds at 8:45 and searched for a place to park. I got out of my car and ran over to the half-built Himalaya ride, ready to start my day. As I looked over at the ride, I noticed that the booth was up, as well as some of the new scenery panels on the bottom half of the ride. The sweeps and wheels were also installed and ready for the cars to be assembled. Moments later, Terrence and the rest of the workers showed up and approached me. Are you ready to work, Small Fry? Both Terrence and Daryl called me Small Fry, Shorty, or Youngster, simply because I was the youngest of all of them. Let's get started, I replied. We began the day by setting up the rest of the red and black top canvas, which came in 4 pieces altogether. One guy climbed onto the top of the ride as another worker and I gave him the part of the canvas. I knew the canvas was a huge piece, but I didn't expect it to be so heavy. After the roof canvas was up, it was time to install the back scenery, and I couldn't wait to see what the rest of the artwork looked like. On this ride, all the scenery panels were made out of metal instead of wood like the older ones were, and all of the artwork was airbrushed instead of hand-painted. The back of this Himalaya had painted scenery from top to bottom of a snowy field with a few skiers. Another difference was the making of the sleigh-shaped cars. Although they still had the traditional sleigh-shaped design, it looked like the parts were somehow cast instead of cut out. Instead of the fact they put in the chrome skiers and stars onto the sides of the cars, they were already molded together, which was very interesting. During my first day of setting up the Himalaya, I was introduced to a few more workers, including Chaz, who was one of the operators/DJs of the ride, and JR, who was much older than the other guys. He was a hard worker, but a bit of a grouch at times. When we were halfway finished assembling the cars, the workers decided to install the tunnel that had the traditional winter theme with skiers. All the artwork was done in bright colors with a lot of detail. It looked very impressive. Minutes later, I began to wonder where the mirror ball was stashed. I was actually going around asking everybody about the giant center mirror ball. I knew it had to be somewhere in the trailer, but where? After the tunnel was assembled, two of the workers went inside the trailer and removed a huge wooden board from the back. There it was, the crown jewel itself, the giant mirror ball. It sat with the rest of the ride's lighting and sound equipment right there in full view. There were 3 large colored spotlights, 2 reds and 1 blue, and a huge strobe light that would later be hooked at the back of the ride and aimed toward the inside of the tunnel. There was also a small chrome siren, along with the rest of the ride's sound equipment. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. As soon as I laid my eyes on that beautiful ball sitting in the back of the trailer, I started jumping down and screaming, there it is, as I pointed at it. I really didn't care if they thought I was crazy. I felt like I just saw a celebrity. I've never seen the mirror ball from a Himalaya ride up close before, so I couldn't help but go up to the ball and touch it. Like the Himalaya Trippers, this ride also had the small hanging mirror ball, which they apparently only used once. I asked Chaz about the smaller mirror ball, but he told me that they had something better to take its place, so they didn't use it anymore. In the back of my mind, I wanted to ask if I could have it, but I chickened out, and I still regret not asking about it. As we finished up the cars, Charles came by carrying 2 disco lights, which I once saw at a roller rink. These lights project a bunch of bright, colorful beams as they swirl all over the place. They happen to belong to the Himalaya, along with a huge kaleidoscope effect lighting fixture that was hung in the middle of the ride and aimed at the giant mirror ball, as did the 3 colored spotlights. This day couldn't get any better than this, I thought. After all these years of wanting a Himalaya of my own, now that I had my first experience setting one up made me want one even more. Most of the day, as I helped with the setup, I talked with another worker by the name of Jerry, also known as Big Tree, who normally worked the Thunderbolt ride but also helped set up and tear down the Himalaya if needed. To this day, I never asked him how he got his nickname. He wasn't that tall nor big, just average height. As I was talking to him about my dreams and my goals to have my very own Himalaya someday, and to have a career as an artist for amusement rides or anything of that nature, he gave me some good advice. You can make anything possible just as long as you put your mind to it and not let anything or anybody tell you differently. To this day, I kept this advice in mind. After spending hours in the hot July sun, it was time to quit for the day. The Himalaya was finally starting to take its shape, as was the rest of the fair, even though we still had 2 more days to set up before the big opening night. After taking my last glance at the nearly finished ride, I went down to the fair office to pick up my pay and then drove back home. I was exhausted when I finally made it home, especially being in a hot sun all day long, but at the same time, I was looking forward to the next day. I actually had a good sleep that night, and I woke up the next morning the same time as before, bright and early. I hopped into the shower, watched a little television, and I was out the door at 8 a.m. to make it back to the fairgrounds by 8:45. I found a place to park and even had time to make a pit stop at a traveling cafeteria tent in the Midway for some breakfast. Afterward, I went to the Himalaya where I saw Terrence and Daryl. They mentioned to me that we had to meet up with everybody at the Music Express ride for roll call. There I sat in one of the cars until it was time to head back to our ride and get to work. The first task, which was one of the things I've always wanted to do, was to help carry the giant mirror ball to the center of the ride. Daryl and another worker went into the trailer to get the ball, and I followed behind them. "Don't start without me," I cried out as I rushed over to the back of the trailer where the ball sat, beating the others. I put my hands on the mirror ball, and one of the guys helped me turn it over to its side and roll it to the end of the trailer. 2 other guys were waiting to grab onto the ball and help us carry it to the middle of the ride. I knew the ball was large, but I never expected it to be so heavy. It took the 4 of us to carry it up the stairs. The weight of the ball was toward me and pressing against my chest. We reached the platforms and finally made our way to the center axle of the ride where the ball was placed. Afterward, we installed the fancy light poles, which they call horns. The horns were placed onto the outside structure of the ride along with the Himalaya sign. A hoist was used to help carry the bright, flashy letters onto the top of the ride while a worker climbed onto the front of the structure to assemble the parts. The Himalaya was pretty much complete, so Terrence let me take the rest of the day off while they stayed and installed the rest of the ride's lighting and sound equipment. I went down to the fair office to pick up my pay, and I left the fairgrounds around noon. It was still early in the day, but I wasn't ready to go back home, so I decided to get some lunch at a nearby Hardee's. I then went to see my high school friend Tommy, who I hadn't seen since graduation. As we started reminiscing about the good times we had in high school, I told him about working at the Himalaya for the first time and my experience of setting up the ride and carrying that big mirror ball around. An hour later, after a few good laughs over our trip down memory lane, I decided to go back home and escape the hot sun. Terrence gave me the next day off, so I slept in as long as I could. For the rest of the day, I did nothing but to think about the fair being at the Himalaya the next night when everything finally opened. I never would have thought in my entire life that this job would have happened for someone like me. It felt like I had reached another huge milestone, so I had to look my best for the first official day, especially since lots of girls happened to attend the fair. Later that evening, I decided to give myself a good shave, trimmed my mustache, and picked out my best earring. Last but not least, I had my hair redone in cornrows with black and blue beads hanging at the end of each braid. I was looking sharp and was ready for the ladies. I couldn't wait to go back to the fairgrounds the next day. When roll call was over, it was time to go to our rides and test them out and get them open. I was anxious to get the night started and to see the new Himalaya in action. As soon as we got back to the Himalaya, Terrence and one of the other foremen by the name of Gabriel, who for some reason also went by Goose, made an abrupt decision. They decided to send me over to the Thunderbolt ride with Big Tree, while another local guy by the name of Patrick, who was also helping out the year, stayed at the Himalaya. My mouth dropped to the ground and my heart fell down to the pit of my stomach. I was not a happy guy with that sudden decision, but I decided to stick it out and give the Thunderbolt ride a chance. I would be working with Goose, Big Tree, and JR. Goose immediately sent me over to the Thunderbolt. Big Tree was sitting in the operator's booth testing out the ride and make sure everything ran smoothly. Minutes later, Goose took me over to the main office to get my uniform. He also informed me that I would be meeting one of the owners of the carnival, and apparently they didn't allow their male employees to wear earrings, so I took out my earring before I reached the office. A gentleman was standing in front of the trailer. He happened to be one of the owners, John. Goose introduced me to John, and he informed him that I was just there to help out for the 2 weeks. John gave me the official welcome as he handed me a red striped uniform shirt to wear. He also told me that not only couldn't the male employees wear earrings, they couldn't have long hair or a ponytail. Thankfully, John let me keep my hair, but then suggested that I should do something different with it. He made me buy one of their company hats to wear so I could hide my hair in it. It cost me $5, but they gave it to me and took the money out of my pay, which I would be receiving at the end of teardown. I couldn't believe that the day I looked forward to and had such sleepless night over had taken such a rotten turn. But I didn't have time to be upset, let alone give this whole situation a second thought. So I tucked in my beads and headed back to the Thunderbolt ride where I was stationed. Big Tree was more than happy to have me on board, but I was disappointed about how my evening had turned out so far. "You're definitely going to like working at this ride," Big Tree said to me. "You will not believe how many girls you will meet." Big Tree was right on the money about that one. I received phone numbers, was offered dates, and one girl even pinched me on the cheek. And when I say cheek, I don't mean my face. As I walked the platforms of the Thunderbolt, I couldn't help but look over to the Himalaya. What a beautiful sight it was. I watched it light up the night sky. Colorful beams of light swirled all over the inside of the ride from the 2 disco lights which were hung inside the ride and aimed at the speeding cars, while the mirror ball sparkled as it spun around and reflected red and blue beams of light all over the place. The strobe light flashed brightly inside the ride's tunnel, and the Himalaya sign did some flashing like I've never seen before. The sun on this particular Himalaya performed some kind of Las Vegas style effects that were truly amazing. The whole view of the ride was breathtaking. The Thunderbolt has some great lighting effects as well, as colorful lighted panels inside the ride flash and chase in different patterns, which was a perfect crowd pleaser, along with a very impressive sound system. This ride also had a recent paint job which was winter themed, similar to the Flying Bob's ride, but now for some reason that ride wasn't around anymore. The music choice on the Thunderbolt was a mixture of hip-hop, R&B, and some heavy metal at times. Occasionally, Stump by Kirk Franklin would play on the ride, which was usually a crowd favorite. The ride speakers were loud and full of so much bass that one time a speaker almost blew off my hat while I was walking down the platforms. However, there was one thing this ride didn't have besides a good siren, and that was a microphone. Throughout my first night at the fair, I spotted some people from high school and a few friends from my old neighborhood in Dover, Delaware. My mother came along with Aunt Christine and my cousin Betty, who stopped by the ride to see me. "How come you're not at the Himalaya?" my mother asked. I explained to her that they were planning on trading me back and forth, meaning sometimes I'd be at the Thunderbolt and other times I'd be at the Himalaya, which was what I thought. My cousin Betty came up and talked to me for a minute. "I know you like those flashing lights on that ride, don't you?" she asked. I told her I did, but I knew I liked the lights on the new Himalaya a lot more. My mother asked me what time the fair closed so she could pick me up. I told her probably around 11 or later. As the ride cycle and the Thunderbolt came to an end, I went back to work and started to unlock the lap bars as my family continued to walk down the midway. My first 2 nights working at the fair were abruptly cut short, however. On the first night, my mother came back around 11 and we were still swamped with customers. She then decided to put me in an awkward and embarrassing situation. "I thought you said we were closing at 11 o'clock, she yelled out and made a scene at my expense. As she repeatedly told me she was ready to leave, I told her that I couldn't leave the ride until closing. My mother wouldn't take no for an answer, so I had to convince Big Tree and Goose to let me leave. I explained to them that she was my only ride home until I got my car fixed. Luckily, they were pretty cool about it. They understood my situation and let me go for the night. I left the fair furious and humiliated. I couldn't sleep because I was thinking about everything that happened that night, and on top of everything, I had to figure out another way to wear my hair so I could hide it in my hat. There was no way in hell I was getting a haircut, especially for something that only lasted 2 weeks. Later that night, I took out my cornrows and tied my hair in a really tight bun so I could hide it in my hat. The next morning, I had to be dropped off at the midway again by my mother. She apologized to me about the previous night and told me to call home as soon as the fair closed. I walked to the fairgrounds and met everyone at the Music Express for roll call, and just like before, I was shipped back over to the Thunderbolt ride. I looked unhappily back over at the Himalaya. As we tested out the Thunderbolt ride to make sure everything was working properly, Big Tree let me go on the ride. I immediately hopped in one of the cars as the ride started. I've ridden in the ride numerous times in the past, but it felt good having special privileges for a change. Later that day, Goose let me go on an hour break, and the first thing I had to do was to ride the new Himalaya. Chad sat in the operator's booth while Terrence and Daryl stood at the front of the ride waiting for the customers to board. I asked them if I can get on the ride, but they told me I had to wait until some customers hopped on before I could. So I decided to stay and wait for a customer to show up so I could finally try it out. About 5 minutes later, some customers came to the ride with their tickets, so they let me board. This was also the first time at the fair that they allowed single riders on the Himalaya. Normally it was prohibited, or at least until the last day. But I guess since it was a brand new ride, it became a whole new beginning for other single riders. I hopped in one of the sleigh-shaped cars and anxiously waited for the ride to start. I wish I could have ridden the ride at night with all the lights going, but as long as I could get on the ride, and for free I may add, it was all I could ask for. The ride started, and I took the time to listen to Chaz as he talked to the microphone. I noticed that he was performing the same voice routine as the guy who ran the ride when I first laid eyes on it, as well as the previous guy who had came along after him. He really didn't sound anything like them at all, even though he was performing the same act as the first few guys who came before him. The Himalaya was going at a good speed and went a lot faster throughout the whole ride cycle. I looked over at the mirror ball as it spun with the ride. I was used to seeing the mirror ball on the Himalaya rotating in the opposite direction like on their previous ride. On this one, however, the mirror ball spun in the same direction as the ride itself, which I thought was a little odd. But as soon as I heard the wailing of that siren, it felt like the Himalaya had never left. It just came back with a brand new identity. Toward the end of the ride cycle, Daryl stood on the opposite side of the ride, across from the control booth, holding a small bottle of water. As soon as he saw me coming out of the tunnel, he splashed me in the face when I zoomed by. "You bastard!" I screamed out. I started to laugh while Chaz sped up the ride again, and the siren wailed one last time. As the ride slowed down, I pointed at Daryl and looked at him in the face while trying not to laugh. "I'm gonna get you," I said to him. Daryl snickered and said, "We'll see." After a very impressive experience on the newly improved Himalaya, I decided to stop for lunch at Wells Traveling Cafeteria. I was a carnival employee, so I received a meal ticket. Every time I ordered my meals from there, it came out of my pay. After I filled my belly with a good hearty meal of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, as well as other fixings which melted in my mouth and felt great in my stomach, I noticed I had another half hour to kill. So I took a 5-minute walk down the Midway and watched the Himalaya spin its riders and listened to this loud music and siren. I decided to ride the Enterprise before returning to work. I went up the steps and showed the worker my employee ID card. This guy turned out to be one of the rudest people I've ever met in my entire life. "Take off your damn hat," he barked at me. "Excuse me?" I responded. "You better take off your damn hat or you're not getting on the ride." Now, I didn't mind taking off my hat just to ride, but he had to be such an obnoxious jerk. My first instinct was just to walk away, but I figured since I was already there, I might as well just stay and ride. And besides, I was not going to let him ruin my day. After the ride was over, it was time for me to go back to the Thunderbolt. As the sun started to set, the rides and the game booths on the entire Midway lit up one by one. As the night progressed, the crowd thickened with families and teenage thrill seekers. Later that night, things were going great. Riders started arriving in packs, great music blasted from the speakers, and I was having a lot of fun and meeting new people. I looked over at the well-lit Himalaya and looked as beautiful as ever, with its colorful disco lights swirling all over the place, along with the sparkling mirror ball. The whole night was going without a hitch until all of a sudden, a strong gust of wind swept through the entire Midway. Clouds of dust filled the air and huge bolts of lightning ripped through the night sky that then opened up and poured down buckets of rain. While the Thunderbolt ride was still running, people were scattering all over the fair, either trying to seek shelter or heading to their cars. I looked over to the Himalaya and saw the most horrific sight I've ever seen. Part of the red and black canvas was being ripped off the roof structure by the strong wind. As I looked in horror, the Thunderbolt finally came to a complete stop. We let the riders off and they started to flee the Midway. After the ride was cleared, we all rushed inside the control booth and waited out the storm. "So what do we do now?" I asked. "It's pouring down non-stop and it's storming like crazy. Shouldn't we close the ride and get out of here?" Bantry and Goose told me that we had to stay where we were unless the supervisor gave us the okay. The storm may pass at any time. Goose also added that our ride was 95% metal, so that made us human lightning rods. "Oh, thanks a lot. I feel so much better now," I yelled sarcastically. I was already shaken up about what happened with the Himalaya's canvas, and now I have to worry about being barbecued if lightning struck our ride with us in it. I thought my first ride night was interesting, but this was just plain nuts. Goose asked me if I had a ride home. I told him I had to call so someone could pick me up. He told me I can go ahead and leave for the night since there was only an hour left before they closed up. Seconds later, I bolted out the control booth, jumped down the ride stairs, and ran like hell in the fire of the storm to find a payphone to call home. I ran over to the grandstand building and called home to tell someone I was ready to be picked up. I then ran as fast as I could to the parking lot to wait for my ride. Minutes later, the storm started to clear out, and most of the fair reopened for the last hour. "Oh, perfect timing," I shouted out as I threw my hands up in disgust. I stood there soaked from head to toe. About 20 minutes later, my Aunt Christine pulled up. She had been at the house and had come by to take me back home. I hopped into the car and we drove off. Though my first 2 nights started on the rough side, things slowly started to improve as the days progressed. The next morning, my stepfather replaced a broken headlight on my car so I could finally drive to the fairgrounds and be more independent. Once I started driving again, things at the fair were going great, and I was having a lot of fun and meeting people while working at the Thunderbolt. But in the back of my mind, I wonder if they were ever going to switch me over to the Himalaya, which was the main reason I volunteered in the first place. Later that night before closing, I went over to the Himalaya where the last 2 paying customers were boarding the ride. I would have hopped on the ride myself, but instead I wanted to see it in action with all of its lights working. Every night I've taken a glance at this beautiful ride, but this time I finally had a front row seat and I couldn't wait to see the show. The funny thing though was that there was no music playing on the ride because the sound equipment was turned off for the night. The ride started and the white boarding lights went out and the red and blue mirror ball spotlights came on. The ride started to pick up speed as the colorful disco lights suddenly came on, adding to the mirror ball lights. The Himalaya went faster and faster. The strobe lights started flashing in the tunnel and the siren started wailing. Even though there was no music playing, the Himalaya became poetry in motion. All 24 sleigh cars looked like one big blur with millions of colored lights swirling all over the place. It was the most amazing sight I've ever laid eyes on, and the mirror ball itself looked stunning. The ride finally started slowing down. The light show ended, and the white boarding lights came back on. It came to a complete stop, and the last 2 lucky riders departed the ride. It was finally closing time, and the lighted attractions on the midway started to shut down one by one. Before I left the fairgrounds, I took a minute to talk to Terrence and Daryl from the Himalaya. I told them that I had a big surprise for them, but they couldn't see it until the next morning. They asked what it was, but I told them that I couldn't tell them and they were going to have to wait until I brought it in the next day. "I can't wait to see what it is," Daryl said with a big grin on his face. Before I drove home, I decided to make a pit stop at a nearby McDonald's to get some food. I received my order along with a large cold orange drink, which I just couldn't wait for. As I started to head home, I suddenly had to make a sharp turn, which made my drink fall open and spill all over the floor. I tried to pick up the cup as quickly as possible, but it was already empty. I never had a chance to take one sip before it spilled. As thirsty as I was too tired to turn back to get another drink, let alone wait in line. So I took my food home and poured myself a tall glass of cold water, which really hit the spot. The next morning was halfway through Fair Week, and I decided to bring in my Himalaya model for everyone to see. I carefully grabbed my model from the trunk of my car and carried it to the Himalaya, which was about a half football field away from where I parked. Terrence was the first person I saw who was already at the ride. "What is that you're carrying?" he said. "This is my model of the Himalaya ride, which I built myself," I explained to him. Terrence was truly amazed and said, "This is the neatest thing I've ever seen. It looks just like the real thing." Then Daryl showed up along with Goose and the rest of the guys from both rides. "What the hell is that?" Daryl asked. Terrence told him about my model as more workers from the other rides came over just to take a look at what I had brought. "You really built this thing?" Daryl asked, amazed. "I sure did," I answered proudly. Everyone who saw my model was so moved that they were actually trying to buy it from me. Daryl was the first to ask me how much I was willing to sell it for, and then suddenly another worker came by and asked for a price. Then another and another. I politely told everyone that it wasn't for sale, which they completely understood, but they just couldn't take their eyes off of it. One worker from another ride who came by and saw my model told me that he also built scale models on the side, and he took the time to show me one of his pieces, a scale model kit of the octopus ride. He was even nice enough to give me one of his other scale model kits, which was some kind of barn. It was such an honor to receive a gift from a fellow model builder. After a few minutes of show and tell, it was time to meet everyone at the Music Express for roll call and then be off to our rides. Terrence let me put the model inside the Himalayas trailer for safekeeping until the end of the day. It was the first armband day of the week, and the midway was already packed the first hour of the fair open. It was a busy day, and after constantly running the steep platforms of the Thunderbolt, I finally received an hour break. As I took a stroll around the midway, I saw a familiar face. I couldn't believe who it was. It was the guy who operated the previous Himalaya who took over when the first guy who operated the ride left in the early 90s. I'd always wanted to meet the man, but I hadn't been too intimidated by him. Luckily, he attended to look my way as I nodded to him. "Hey, what's going on?" he greeted me wearing a big smile, which broke the ice for me. I told him that I was a big fan of the Himalaya and that I had wanted to meet him for years, but had been too chicken to approach to him. Surprisingly, he actually turned out to be a really nice guy all along. He introduced himself to me as Tim as he shook my hand. As we continued to talk for a minute, Tim told me that he had actually lived in town all this time, which was funny because I had never seen him anywhere but at the Himalaya once a year when the fair arrived. As we continued to chat, I mentioned to Tim that I was working at the fair that year, and he told me that he was now back at the Himalaya. I told him that I was supposed to be at the Himalaya too, but after I helped him set it all up, they suddenly shipped me over to the Thunderbolt. "Is that right?" he said. I answered back, sounding very disappointed. I told him that the Thunderbolt was a great ride and fun to work at, but I personally felt that the Himalaya was where I belonged. Tim suddenly said to me, "Maybe that might happen. You never know." I told him that we'll see before the fair ended. After shooting the breeze with Tim and finally meeting him after all these years, we shook hands one last time and went our separate ways. I felt this was one of the best days I had in a long time, but I soon found out that my lucky streak wasn't over just yet. Later on that busy night, after continuously running the platforms in the Thunderbolt, Goose suddenly showed up out of nowhere wanting me to follow him. I didn't know what to expect or what he wanted. I actually thought I was in trouble or something. But little did I know that I was finally going to get my wish. I was actually being sent over to the Himalaya. Goose asked me why I have never mentioned to him that I wanted to work the Himalaya. I figured that he already knew, or maybe it slipped his mind. I told him that I thought he was going to switch me back and forth working on both rides every other day, but Goose told me that was never the case. He also added that if he knew I wanted to be at the Himalaya from the beginning, he wouldn't have sent me over to the Thunderbolt in the first place. Goose told me that he would have been more than happy to send me over to the Himalaya if it was something that I really wanted to do. I tried to figure out how he had found out I wanted to work the Himalaya. Maybe Tim told him, or one of the other guys, or maybe when he saw my model, he finally figured it out on his own. Who knows? To this day, I still have no idea how he found out. Seconds later, we made it over to the Himalaya where I would start the second half of the fair. As we rushed up the stairs to the platforms of the ride, Goose suddenly put his arm around me and said, "Here we are. This is what you always wanted." Even though I was finally going to be part of the Himalaya crew, everything was happening so fast that I didn't know what to think at first. And to make things more interesting, the sudden jump from the Thunderbolt to the Himalaya didn't start out warm and friendly. Goose was by my side as he tried to tell a rude Chaz who was operating the ride at the time that I was going to work the Himalaya while he took Patrick over to the Thunderbolt. Chaz started to yell repeatedly, "No, go back to your ride," over the microphone while running a full load of riders. Things got so bad that Chaz and Goose started to get into a heated argument all because of me. I didn't mean to cause an altercation between the two, so I decided to step in and told Goose to just forget the whole thing. I told him that if it's going to be such a big deal, I would just go back to the Thunderbolt ride because changing positions was just not worth all the drama. I mean, I really want to be at the Himalaya, but not like this. Goose then said to me, "I'm not going to let you do that. This is what you've always dreamed of, so I'm going to make that happen for you. And don't you worry about him. Remember, he works for me just like you do." Now, I knew Goose was a nice guy, but I had no idea that he cared so much. Everything calmed down a few minutes later, and I finally received my wish. I was at the Himalaya, but I felt like I couldn't enjoy it right away because everything had happened between Goose and Chaz. Moments later, I really started to feel badly about fleeing the Thunderbolt and Big Tree after they had been so nice to me the whole time. I really felt awful about the whole thing until Goose came back and asked me if Big Tree could borrow some of my cassettes to play on the Thunderbolt. I was finally starting to feel a little better after letting Big Tree borrow some of my music to play on this ride. Minutes later, Tim showed up to take over operating the ride. I was happy to see my new friend, especially now that we had officially met. "You finally made it over here," Tim yelled over the microphone. "I told you what happened, didn't I?" I slowly nodded, simply because I couldn't help but to think about what it took to get me over here in the first place. And I also felt like this was the closest thing I would ever get to owning a Himalaya ride. After finally getting myself situated and readjusted, the ride cycle ended, so I immediately started unlocking all the lap bars. The riders quickly departed from the cars and headed down the stairs to make room for the next load of riders. As soon as Terrence opened the elastic rope, the next load of enthusiastic riders started pouring in, and I knew exactly what to do. I told them all to get in and not to skip any seats. I knew how to arrange all the riders from smallest to tallest, meaning the smallest person had to be on the inside of the cars, while the tallest person sat on the outside where you'd basically be crushed by the other one or two riders sitting next to you. I also knew how to lock everyone in as well. I then double-checked everything just to make sure all the lap bars were locked. As soon as all the cars were full, it was all systems go. The white boarding lights went out, the colored disco lights came on, and the ride began as the mirror ball spun, shooting millions of light beams everywhere. Tim started entertaining the crowd with his legendary microphone act as the Himalaya began to speed up, and Super Freak by Rick James blared from the ride speakers. "You want to go faster," Tim yelled to the crowd. "You want to go real, real fast?" The crowd screamed so loudly that I could barely hear the music. "Sit back and hang on tight as we give you that super speed." Tim hit the strobe light and the siren as the Himalaya sleigh-shaped car spun around, coasting up and down the undulating circular track at lightning speed. And I couldn't believe I was finally part of this beautiful speed demon. I stood there watching the screaming crowd being whipped around on this amazing work of art. Tim usually speeds up the ride at least 3 times during the ride cycle, but sometimes he likes to play a trick on the riders toward the end of the ride. Yeah, some of them would like them to speed it one more time. As soon as the crowd screams, "Yeah," he would either say "psych" or "I'll take it fast if you give me 5 more tickets." My personal favorite saying is when he asks the crowd, "Guess what?" As I'll say, "What?" Tim would respond, "It's time to get your butt off this ride, that's what," and then tops it off with a foolish laugh. The rest of the night was nothing but full loads of screaming riders until it reached that witching hour when the whole fair finally started to die down at closing time. I went to the back and changed my shirt and grabbed my model from the ride's trailer where it had been sitting since the beginning of the day. As I started to lead the ride, Charles, the supervisor, was sitting in one of the cars. "Hey, how much you want for that model?" he asked. I just stood there thinking, here we go again. He told me that he was just messing with me, even though I already knew. I left the midway carrying the model and wearing a big smile while thinking about how my day went. Even though I hit a huge speed bump toward the end, all in all, it was a great day. From the next day toward the end of the fair, everything finally went my way. I was at the Himalaya, I was having the time of my life, and I was meeting a lot of new people and seeing some of my old friends from my old Ann Avenue neighborhood who came by to visit the ride. I even had some phone numbers thrown at me from various girls who went on the ride. I had a lot of great experiences at the Himalaya, but there were times when I didn't get along with everybody with whom I worked. Dale and I had a few run-ins with each other, but we ended up shaking hands afterward. Personally, I think he liked to pick on me simply because I was the youngest, but that's just my opinion. On the night before the last day at the fair, we had a few surprise visitors who came over to the Himalaya. First was Joe, who decided to come to the fair to check out the new masterpiece. Now, I haven't really had any contact with Joe since the previous year, since the night at the music express when he decided to give me a hard time. I've been really trying to avoid him, but while I loaded up the next load of riders, Joe decided to come by and give me a hand. I didn't know what to think, but it was very thoughtful of him to step in and help me out. He decided to stay and help for a while, so I let him have my spot and made my way inside the tunnel, which I personally liked because I still had the nice view of the mirror ball. I stood right there with the huge strobe light attached to the back of the ride. As the ride started, Tim yelled out his usual encouragement in the microphone. "You want to go faster? Let me hear you make some noise!" The crowd screamed, the ride sped up, and I just happened to turn my head for a minute in the direction of the strobe light when it suddenly turned on and flashed in front of my eyes. "Ah, damn it!" I shouted. Tim laughed when he saw me rubbing my eyes and shaking my head, trying to get my eyesight back to normal. When my sight returned, I watched the strobe light flash on the speeding cars as they whisked by, going in and out of the tunnel over and over again. It was one of those special moments when I wish I had a camcorder. What an amazing sight it was, being inside that tunnel and watching the strobe flash as the cars sped by. An hour later, Joe decided to leave, and I went back to my usual place on the right side of the platforms across from the control booth. The night was still young, and the Himalaya was busier than ever when another visitor came over to the ride. This guy went over to the control booth where Tim was operating the ride. Tim handed the microphone over to the guy, and he started talking and performed the same act as Tim. But it sounded like he had been doing that same routine for years. I mean, this guy had it down cold. He talked on the microphone while Tim controlled the ride. As I heard him perform, I suddenly had suspicion. I wonder if that was the same guy who used to operate the old Himalaya back when I first laid eyes on the ride. I asked Daryl, who was walking toward me. Daryl informed me that he was indeed the same guy who used to operate the old Himalaya ride back when it was new. It was such a huge surprise and an honor to be part of that ride with the legend himself. I remember him and the way he always had the crowd hyped with his wild talk when I first saw the ride on that summer night. I tried to get his attention and waved to him as I smiled from ear to ear. "Hey, what's up, man?" he said to me over the microphone as he waved back. Unfortunately, I never really had the chance to meet him face to face before he left, basically because I was too busy with the ride and I couldn't leave my spot, which really put a damper on my spirits. I had wanted to meet him for years, but I missed out on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to finally meet the main man himself that night. Though I was pretty upset about the whole thing, I still had fun at the Himalaya while loading and unloading all the adrenaline junkies who came to the ride. The Himalaya had numerous full loads of screaming riders all through the night until the last hour when the crowd started to gradually die down. At closing time, Charles came over to the Himalaya and ordered us to start taking down some of the details from the ride, including the tunnel and the 2 disco lights. We had some help from Big Tree and the other guys from the Thunderbolt ride. A couple of guys went over to the back of the tunnel while a couple more climbed to the middle of the ride behind the mirror ball to help take down the tunnel. Another worker started to uninstall the disco lights and take them down. During the pre-teardown, Big Tree of all people started to do a 180 on me. I guess he held some kind of grudge against me because he started to give me such a rough time for no apparent reason. I just couldn't figure out why. This was the same guy who had pretty much taken me under his wing. I thought of him as my uncle, and now all of a sudden I went from being a beloved nephew to an unwanted stepson. "Hey, hurry up," he barked at me as I returned back to the ride and waited for another part of the tunnel to be carried over to the trailer. The hell was up with him, I asked myself, as I still couldn't figure out why he was so mad at me. Before I left that night, Joe asked me a favor. Yeah, he invited me to go with him to the next spot at the carnival normally went. I told him that I had to give it some thought. And plus, I couldn't really trust him anymore since he decided to turn on me at the Music Express that previous year. He told me that he was renting out a suite, and it would be just me, Tim, and him. Even though that plan sounded pretty tempting, I still had to give it some thought. So after Joe's continuous begging for me to tag along with him, I finally told him to let me sleep on it. I would give him my answer the next day. He told me that was fine, but he really wanted me to come with him. So I guess that means that we were friends again. During the drive home, I had a chance to analyze everything that happened. I tried to figure out what the problem was between Big Tree and me. It suddenly hit me. I think the whole thing happened when I made that sudden jump from his ride, the Thunderbolt, over to the Himalaya. I thought to myself, no wonder he was in such a funky mood. I started to feel a bit lousy about the whole situation, not to mention Big Tree himself. He had been such a great friend to me, and I guess he felt like I betrayed him, even though that was never the case. After a good night's sleep, I got up, showered, got dressed, and made my way back up to the fairgrounds for my last day working at the fair. I knew I was going to be there for a long time because we were tearing down our ride later that night, right after closing. I already knew it was going to be a long night, but I really didn't have any idea how long. This would be my first time tearing down the ride, let alone so late at night, so I assumed that it would be an experience I would never forget. I met everyone at the Music Express from one last roll call. I saw Big Tree there. He saw me, smiled, and gave me a thumbs up. I guess that was his way of apologizing to me about the other night. I felt a sense of relief. Earlier that day before we opened, Terrence decided to take some pictures of all of us at the ride. Most of the pictures that he took were his brother Daryl, who was the biggest ham of all of us combined. In one picture, Daryl decided to climb on top of the big mirror ball in the center of the ride and pose while standing on it. I personally didn't like that at all. Plus, he looked like an idiot standing up there. But I guess that's just Daryl being Daryl. After y'all posed for the camera, it was time to open. So Tim turned on the music as we waited for our first load of customers. That day actually started off pretty slowly, but as soon as the sun went down, the attendance went up. Way up. The last night of the state fair literally went out with a bang as fireworks lit up the night sky during the last few hours of the fair. Later that evening, Joe arrived and headed straight to my direction. "So what's your answer?" he asked. "Are you coming to the next spot with us?" I told Tim that I decided to turn it down, but I was courteous enough to thank him for the offer. "Well, I guess we're going to have all the fun without you," he yelled out. "Well, I guess so," I said back to him. Even though I considered us friends again, I still felt like I couldn't trust him like I once had. During the last half hour, Tim announced on the microphone that he was shutting off the music and unplugging the stereo equipment. Tim operated the ride without music during the last 20 minutes, but surprisingly, it didn't faze the full load of riders and the long line we still had. At midnight, we actually had to turn down the waiting customers because it was time to close and tear down our ride. As soon as all the fairgoers cleared the midway, we began to move the center star-printed canvas that covered the sweeps. Even though I was there all day long, I couldn't wait for my first experience of tearing down this huge ride. The first thing I mentioned to the other workers was that I wanted to be the one to carry the big mirror ball back to the trailer. We had some extra help from some locals who volunteered to help us tear down our ride. Some of the workers climbed up to the ride structure and take down the sign and top scenery panels. A couple of others climbed onto the very top of the ride to take down the red and black canvas, and others started taking down the stairs and the railings that surrounded the sides of the ride. I helped loosen up the center canvas until, out of the blue, I heard some whistling. I turned my head and I saw Daryl, who was standing in the middle of the ride to get my attention. He needed help carrying that giant mirror ball off the ride and back into the trailer, which meant my prayers have been answered. After the mirror ball was removed, we started taking down the rest of the scenery panels from the ride, while a few others started taking apart all the cars, removing the lap bars. It was around 2 a.m., and the ride was only halfway down. I was starting to lose energy fast, and my enthusiasm was gasping for air. As I carried the last piece of the 24 cars into the trailer, Tim was inside putting the parts in their places. He asked in a taunting but friendly manner, "How do you like the Himalaya so far?" "I still like the ride and all, but damn, this is too much," I replied, completely wiped out. Tim laughed loudly at my expense because he knew I was tired and sore, but we still had a long way to go and couldn't stop until every part was back in its trailer. Charles came by with a bottle of water to give us, and I was more than happy to receive a bottle of ice-cold water. It really hit the spot. I knew the Himalaya had a lot of parts, but I never experienced that we would be there all night long tearing down this one ride. After hours of non-stop work dismantling and carrying part after part, I watched the sun come up for the first time in my life. The Himalaya was finally down to its skeleton. It was around 6 a.m., and there was still a lot more work to do. I tried to muster up as much energy as possible, but I was losing the fight. We finally finished tearing down our ride around 9 a.m., and I couldn't believe that I actually stayed awake for 24 hours straight. I may have felt tired, sore, and hungry, but I was very proud of myself for sticking it out through the whole experience. Daryl put his arm around me. "You did a great job with us," he said. "You showed me that you are a great worker, and I'm proud of you. I know there were times when I was real hard on you, but you have to understand, when it comes to hard work, I have no friends." "And you're just now telling me this?" I responded. He laughed and shook my hand. 10 minutes later, we all started walking down the dismantled midway to the main office to receive our pay. As I looked around, I noticed that some of the other big rides were still being taken apart, and the music express was only half torn down. Here it was around 9:45, and some of the other big rides were still being dismantled. I was just happy that I survived my first teardown. "Oh, you sure you didn't want to travel with us?" Daryl asked. I replied, "Thanks, but no thanks. This experience was more than enough for me." It was funny, though. After everything that I've done and been through, I still had that burning desire to own my own Himalaya ride someday. But mine would be on my own property, so that way when it's time to tear down, It would be in the morning so we could all get some sleep and be well rested. We reached the main office trailer. I went up to the window, stated my name, which ride I had worked, and waited for my last pay. Prior to getting my pay, I was informed I had a phone message. I needed to call home as soon as I was done with teardown. I used the phone from the office to call home, but I didn't have an idea about what was going on. I figured maybe my mother wanted me to pick up something from the store or something in that nature. Little did I know, I was in for a surprise when she picked up the phone. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes, why wouldn't I be?" I answered. She informed me that she was so worried about that she actually called the cops and had them put out a missing child report. I was furious when I found out what she had done. She had known that I wouldn't be home for a while. "Why did you do that?" I asked, angry. She told me that she didn't know what else to do to make sure I was all right, even though I could pretty much take care of myself. After she hung up, a wise-ass laughing Darryl called me out in front of everybody. "What happened? Your mommy was worried about you?" "Oh, you got jokes," I said to him. The guys may have known what was going on, but I kept my mouth shut or else they would definitely ripped on me. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my stepfather showed up out of nowhere. "What the hell?" I said when I saw him. "Oh, you all right?" he asked me after rolling down this window. "Yeah, man, why are you here?" I snarled. "Your mother told me to look for you and to bring you home," he said. I felt myself shrinking with embarrassment as the guys laughed uproariously at my expense. "Could you say that a little louder? I don't think they heard you," I snapped at him. My stepfather laughed, pulled out, and left the fairground. After he was gone, Tim told me not to worry about it because he too had been through that same ordeal when he was my age and had started helping out at the fair. Then Joe told me that the same thing also happened to him when he first started. After they told me everything they went through, I began to feel a little better. Though I was still pretty ticked off at my mother for what she had done. I mean, I was 18, not 8. After I said my goodbyes and shook hands with everybody and thanked them for letting me be part of their crew, I made my long walk to my car and drove home to get some much-needed sleep. I arrived back at the house around 11 o'clock that morning. I was tired, my eyes were bloodshot and sore, and I was covered in dirt. "Oh, you're home," my mother said as she was cooking breakfast. I was still livid for what she had pulled, but I was just too damn tired and hungry to even get into it with her. All I wanted to do that entire day was sleep. After I took a long hot shower and had some breakfast, I crawled into my bed and slept through most of the day. I got up around 5 o'clock that evening to watch some television, but then I went back to bed at 8:30 at night. After receiving numerous hours of sleep, I finally felt wide awake the next morning, but every muscle in my body was sore. However, I didn't feel like sitting in the house all day, so I decided to go to the mall for a couple of hours to kill some time. I was in a lot of pain as I walked aimlessly around the whole mall. Later, I ran into a few of my friends from my old Dover days. I talked to them for a few minutes, telling them about my first experience working at the Himalaya and that I would never forget. I'll never forget those days I had spent at the fair as long as I lived. I had a lot of new experiences, some great and not so great. And as sore as I felt that day, I felt like everything I had done and everything that had happened to me during those 2 weeks was well worth it and made me want to own the Himalaya ride even more. And there you have it. That was chapter 11. I hope you enjoyed it so far. But be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and let me know what you think. And if you'd like to buy my book, you can buy it on Amazon or my online store along with a ton of fan-based merch. I'll be back on here next month with chapter 12. So as we say in the Himalaya world, keep that mirror ball spinning. Take care.